Chapter 26, A Premonition. Yunobo had been spending a lot of time waking up lately. Hopefully this wasn't a pattern that would be repeated in his day-to-day. Well, at least it was warm, this time. Not like burning hot warm. It was pretty much always that, but the kind of warm where he could feel the sunshine on him, even with his eyes closed. Sunshine. What a weird thought.
I think he's coming to.
Zelda's voice, right above his head. He opened his eyes. Leaning over him was Zelda, and standing on his other side was Paya, and filling up the space behind and above the two of them, looming like the mountain itself from down past his feet, was Daruk. Yunobo's eyes kind of swung back and forth, like he was dizzy, but they settled on Daruk's huge grin, bushy beard, like the statue come to life. Except that he was surrounded by ghost fires. Yunobo had never seen a ghost before, but he'd heard stories and knew that those undying blue embers could be only one thing. Okay, that's 3. There were 3 figures before, but Zelda and Daruk were one. Wasn't there a monster? The monster. Yunobo leaped to his feet, nearly knocking Paya and Zelda backwards. Daruk just took a few steps back, still grinning as Yunobo looked around. They weren't in the volcano anymore. That really made things seem a lot less threatening, which made the ambiguity even more threatening.
Is everyone okay? What happened? Where's the monster?
That, Zelda said, having regained her composure. She'd taken off her flame breaker helm, was holding it under her arm.
Daruk killed it with the boulder breaker after you gave it to him.
And he noticed that she wore the boulder breaker on her back, and seemed comfortable with the weight,
but when you landed you broke the beast's spine.
He didn't even have time to process that before Daruk cleared his throat, demanding Yunobo's attention.
That was a mighty leap you made back there. Took a lot of guts. Sure. But it took a keen eye. You've got a good head on your shoulders, kid. What's your name?
He stood straighter, throwing his shoulders back, jutting his chest out. It was ridiculous, sure, but he did it anyway. It had never felt more appropriate.
Why Yunobo?
So.
Yunobo.
Daruk clapped one hand on Yunobo's shoulder, and it was so firm that Yunobo had to shift his weight to keep from being shoved to the side.
Did I see you using the protection back there? You wouldn't happen to have inherited it, would you?
It could have been judgmental, but it wasn't. If anything, the boisterousness of his smile had given over to real warmth.
Why yes sir, Doro.
What could you really say to that? Thankful the power. Was gratefulness even the right response? Was he even grateful, really? Too many questions, not enough answers. Whatever he said here, it needed to be true more than it needed to be proper. So,
I wouldn't be much without it. None of that, kid, none of that. Power's good and all, but the protection is just a tool. If anyone else had had the power, they might not have been able to make the jump he did. They might not have even been able to work up the courage to walk up the mountain.
He paused, brows knitting, but that didn't touch the upturn of his mouth.
Not good with words. 100 years. Still can't do this. Look, why'd you come up here? You must have known bad stuff was going down. You must have been frightened. Even the mighty Daruk didn't know how it was going to go.
So, why?
Yeah, I was scared. Doro.
It'd been more than that, though, hadn't it? Maybe a lot more. Did Daruk need to hear all that? No, he didn't. But the champion needed to hear the truth, just like Yunobo needed to tell it, so there was no point trying to talk around it.
But my friends were up here, and I couldn't leave them to face all this alone, Doro. It's just
right, proper, manly, as would be expected of him. None of that felt right, none of that was right. The more he tried to clarify, the murky the answer became, the further he drifted away from the truth. What did that leave him with? He let his hands drop, his posture slumping.
I just couldn't.
Daruk's hand was on his shoulder again, but instead of an impact it was a gentle touch, fingers firm in their grip. Daruk's hand was awfully solid, for a ghost. Solid and warm.
Listen, little guy. You did the right thing, and you can work out the reasons for that later. If it turns out that the whole reason you did it was to help your friends, so much the better. I've only known you a few minutes, Yunobo, but I'm proud of you. Real proud.
Yunobo turned his face away so the champion couldn't see, even though he knew Daruk wouldn't really care.
I'm gonna send you home now, okay? I need to talk to Zelda and Paya before they go, but I have a feeling they won't be headed back down to Goron City right away. If you want to say your goodbyes, you should do it now.
Goodbyes? It wasn't until that second that he realized he'd been expecting to walk down the mountain with them, to have them stay in the city for a little longer. Now they'd be able to talk about normal things. Maybe, but no, they had places to be, didn't they? And they were really, really kind. If he told them how much he was hoping to talk to them, how much he wanted to get to know them better, it would just make things harder for them. So, he wouldn't. He grinned, as wide as he could, and stood straight and proper and turned to face the two women. He bowed in the Hylian style, though low for Goron wasn't very low for Hylians. If he went that low he'd just fall over, and spoke with all the positive energy he could muster.
Thank you both very much. I hope we'll meet again soon. I'm sure we will,
Zelda said, and Paya's answer was too low to hear, but she was looking warmly at him, and that was really all he needed.
Kate.
Light was blossoming at his feet as Dark spoke, gold and wild like the power Zelda had been using.
You don't let anyone call our power by its old name anymore, got it? When you use it, it's Yunobo's protection.
Something in his eyes must have betrayed what he was feeling, because the champion was laughing.
And if they don't like it, they can come to the top of Death Mountain and hear it from the mighty Daruk.
Then the light covered everything, and he was gone and away. Oh man, I'm going to have to tell Bluto why I don't have the boulder breaker anymore. Zelda watched Daruk's body language as a point of light that carried Yunobo rose into the sky, headed for Goron City. Daruk, from what she could remember of how she thought of him before, liked to give off the impression that he existed only in a given moment, paying no mind to the future or to the past. She had believed that, a century ago, watching the lines of his mouth, now, the cast of his eyes as his descendant returned home. She did not know how she could fail so badly to understand another.
He's a good kid,
Daruk said.
Still got a lot to work through, but he'll be okay. Reminds me of myself, really. Better with dogs, hopefully. Dogs?
Something tickled at the back of her mind, but not enough to remember.
Hey. Oh, and don't think you two didn't do a good job too. You were great. Haven't seen anybody fight like you two in a long time.
He paused, gazing into the middle distance.
Which makes sense, I guess.
He snapped back.
Anyway, Tiny Princess, you mentioned that Mifa already gave you her blessing. I want to give you mine. The kid's power will be named for him, now, so Daruk's protection belongs to you.
In another place, another lifetime, this someone else, he would have made a show of the passage here, now, for Zelda. He held out his hand with his palm up. Light gathered there, light tinged with the faintest halo of red, and with a motion of his fingers it floated through the air toward her, as relaxed as dandelion fluff. She did not reach out for it. She watched it settle against her chest piece and then sink down into it, past it, into the place within her where the goddess's power resided. Mifa's power was cool and soothing. Like water, Daruk's power was warm, and felt so solid that just being around it could bolster one's courage.
Anytime you need it,
Daruk said.
Just concentrate. It's not inexhaustible, but this will turn away the heaviest blows. No problem. Daruk's protection is yours now. Use it to annihilate Ganon.
He sighed through his nose.
There, that's out of the way. Now, what's the plan?
The plan. Yes, because of course there was a plan. Her eyes found Paya for confirmation, but the other woman's expression said everything plainly. I will follow your lead. So instead she looked out across the mountain, the course Hyrule itself. The view from far Rudonia allowed her to take in nearly the entire kingdom.
I will free the other champions and their divine beasts, and all of us will destroy Ganon together. I must marshal my own strength before joining the battle, though. We are traveling to different places in Hyrule where I might be able to restore my memory, and my power thereby. Beyond that, I think we will go to Urkala. The Spring of Power is there, and a research laboratory where I might learn more about the ancient technology used to fight Ganon in the past. To the west, a field of green and pink waited, serene and inviting in a way she could not place her finger on. And we will go to the Korok Forest. I made a promise. The Korok Forest. How?
Daruk ran his fingers through his beard.
I'm guessing that means you'd have to go through the Lost Woods. Well, if anyone could do it, it would be you.
Then his eyes lit up.
Wait, did you say Akala? I don't know if she's still around, but one of the great fairies used to make her home in the southern end of Akala, a little way off the main road. If you're headed in that direction, you should definitely stop by and see her.
One of Kotera's sisters. Zelda was sure she remembered the great fairy mentioning that visiting more of them would allow each to bless her with more of their power. If that was true, she couldn't afford not to see them.
It will be to Akala next. Then, Daruk. It occurs to me that a perspective might help me recover my memories.
She unlatched the shake slate from its place on her hip, turned it on, flipped through its screens to the relevant album, then held it up for him to see. Daruk leaned in, squinting.
Do you recognize any of these places?
He was running his fingers through his beard again, the ghost fires dancing around him.
Well, this one here is probably in the desert, though I couldn't say where exactly. And there's Rivali's beast. Ah, there. This one is definitely the Spring of Power. You'll find that north of Akala Citadel. Or west of it. Never been good with geography.
His eyes cupped back, then he leaned forward and tapped the screen with his finger, the force of which Zelda felt all the way down to her elbows.
This one here is actually just down the southwest side of the mountain, near the forest. It's out of your way from Akala, but I could send you there, if you like. Oh, could you? It would save us the better part of a day, and time is of the essence. Isn't it always?
She must have looked as abashed as she felt, because Daruk laughed thunderously.
Don't worry about it, tiny princess. You go do your job, and I'll do mine. When you see the little guy, tell him all Daruk's thinking about him.
The light that enveloped her and Paya was so fast, so insistent, that she didn't even have time to say farewell. In a moment all she could see was Daruk, grinning and waving, and then everything was lost in the brightness. Daruk watched the two rising, lowered his arm, and sighed again.
Still not any good at goodbyes. Really gotta work on that. Or, well, maybe I don't. One benefit of being dead, I suppose, people stop expecting you to mind your manners so much.
He pulled his beard, scratched his head, and then walked to the top of Varubania's head. He didn't have to walk, he could move as far as he wanted without walking, now. Another benefit of being dead. But walking made him feel more anchored in the world, more like he was doing what he was supposed to be doing, and so he walked to the platform on top of his divine beast skull. The mountain spread out before him. She wasn't looking great, the mountain, the temperature was out of control, there were monsters all over the place, and he could see fissures on every slope that exposed the burning magma to open air. Balrudani told him, in that subtle way he'd never really had time to learn while he was alive, all the different ways in which the fire beneath the mountain moved and breathed. The mountain was trembling, waiting for the next explosion of Ganon's fury. Then he settled on Goron City, and for whatever reason he felt the tension melt out of his shoulders. He sat on the platform, legs crossed, and prepared to wait. And think. Thinking definitely made waiting a lot easier, if you had enough to think about, and Zelda and Paya had given him plenty, but Inobo, skinny, still, but his appetite would assert itself eventually, and then the kid would be the size of a mountain, maybe even bigger than his ancestor. Sensitive, too, but it was better that he was sensitive. It'd be harder for him, and the other Gorons would give him grief for a long time, but in the end Yunobo would have a kind of strength and empathy that was rare among anyone. A good kid. Just that one word could put a warm spot in his chest. He thought back to the raised voices of rowdy kids, and how much he had wished for them not to be strong or brave so much as good, and, in a small way, seeing Yunobo made him feel fulfilled. I guess the gods are kind, after all. But good people deserve a good world to grow up in, didn't they? Sure, they did. Nothing more fundamental. And it was the responsibility of people like him to make sure that the world could be good, and that future generations would be able to enjoy the fruits of better circumstances. He hadn't done that, he'd failed pretty spectacularly. But he'd make good, still. Hyrule Castle swelled with the power of the calamity, and if he could feel pain anymore he would have felt the tightness of his fingers biting into his palms. He was itching for a fight. Oh, he'd been itching for a fight for a long time, and the firebite? That had just been a prelude, a prologue to the real thing. That was still to come. A blue light shone in Hyrule Castle, and even from all that distance he could sense an ancient voice raised in mighty song. No, not a prelude, or prologue, or anything like that. The real fight had been going on for a century. He was just late.
But I'm going to be there soon.
He held up his fists, hoping that some portion of his strength could reach out across the kingdom.
Just hold on a while longer, little guy.
The sky was blue over Death Mountain. The light of the morning sun warm and pleasant on Zelda's skin. She hoped that the weather would hold. At the elevation of Goron City, the mountain could actually feel quite cool, and she wasn't dressed quite as warmly as she'd been when she had asked Dark to be the pilot for Valridonia. Well, regardless, the weather was gorgeous now, and she intended to make the best of it. Good weather, beautiful scenery, good company? Was Link good company? Yes, she decided. Not for the first time, he was. Zelda walked up the short path to the small rocky plateau that stood a few meters more elevated than the surrounding mountainside. The perspective this lent was almost unique. Pulling out the shake slate and looking through its viewfinder, she found it was like seeing through the eyes of a bird. A novel perspective, and anyone who hadn't stood in this spot wouldn't know the secret. She took a photograph, saved it to her permanent archives, and smiled at the thought of how others might feel seeing it. They'd gone for some time without speaking, so she broke the silence.
You've known Dark for quite a while, haven't you?
The hero nodded.
Did his letter sound like he was nervous?
He was quiet for a minute, considering his words. Even now, after the time they'd spent traveling together in better companionship, he was careful to be sure of everything that he said. The pressure of his station was always with him, and in this he never let down his guard, even with her, fearing that he would reduce himself in her eyes, and the grim irony squeezed at the inside of her chest.
Dark is not very good at writing down his feelings.
He spoke carefully, too, never too slowly or too quickly.
But yes, I think he's nervous. He's an old hand at everything he does, so this is the first time he's been completely new to something in decades. That makes sense.
It made enough sense that she really should have imagined it before. She thought of all the champions as being infallible, but that couldn't really be true, could it? All of them had things they weren't good at, and maybe Darks was learning new things.
Still, we'll be doing some maintenance on Valridonia to make sure that it is properly calibrated, so that his connection with it can be as smooth as possible.
Link smiled faintly, in a way that reminded her of something else.
We'll see.
She didn't have to ask. The last time she had seen him smile that way, he had been watching fresh recruits training under his supervision. Though he had become withdrawn since taking up the Master Sword and being assigned as her personal guardian, Link had not risen to his position among the rest of the Royal Guard through strength of arm alone. He was also an empathetic and effective leader whose subordinates were fiercely loyal. Doubtless he suspected that Dark's confidence flagging might be related to any problems with his connection, and it was also doubtless that he had just the right thing to say to get the Goron Elder into a better state of mind. She was glad of that. It would be easy to pity herself, because she could never speak to Dark in the way that Link was planning, but more she was forced to appreciate him for who he was. Link was the single soldier in Hyrule who had the most authority. Even the King's Guard were technically subordinate to the princesses. When she came of age and rose to power, Link would have more martial command than even the Dowager King. Would that weigh as heavily on him in the future as the question of Ganon weighed on him now? She hoped not. She could not have said yet exactly why that hope was so desperate. The ground beneath her moved very subtly, and Link was instantly at her side in case she needed something to grab onto for balance. He did not presume to put his hand out, much less touch her. She kept herself steady, though the ramblings of Death Mountain were not wholly strange to her. Still, something about the shake felt unusual, almost local. Zelda could not have said exactly what it was that made her look through the lens of the shake slate again, or why she looked to the road that they had just walked. If she thought to question it, that fled her mind at the sight of the cracks in the road and the surrounding countryside, at the black and purple smoke that oozed out of those fissures with dark promise. Length, she said, and he was already looking. She put the slate away, looking to him instead. His eyes had taken on a different cast. Now the pressure had fallen away from him, replaced by surety, and his eyes took in the surrounding area instantly as he weighed options. But what options could there be here? The hillside was almost completely exposed, with no easy places to hide. From the amount of smoke and malice oozing out of the ground, a copious number of monsters were about to coalesce. The two of them would be found in minutes. "Stay here," he said, speaking in a tone that said their relative authority had swapped places.
Kneel behind that rock and keep your head down. Stay there until I signal it is safe.
Without waiting to see if she would comply, he was already stepping off the front of the outcropping, sliding down the steep face on sure feet. The Master Sword was still on his back.
Link, wait.
He did not look back, did not shout a correction, did not use one of his many hand signals. He just walked toward where the smoke had gathered into clouds of darkness, and out of that dark the shapes began to take form. Those shapes covered the hillside, dozens of them, and as her guardian walked toward them they turned to him with glowing, golden eyes. She knelt behind the rock, but could not keep her eyes from him, from what he was walking into. A shift in pressure, a sound like death rattles, and there they stood, bokoblins in their dozens, skin the color of burnished silver or old rust, carrying weapons made from the bones of dragons. Moblins of black or silver skin, with clubs longer and heavier than a Hylian's body. And at the center of the horde, 3 Lynels, their pelts striped black and white, their weapons hooked and twisting, their eyes locked on the lone Hylian who stood before them. Seeing him from behind, Link gave no sign of the danger he faced. He reached over his shoulder, and the Master Sword's radiance was blinding as he pulled it from its sheath. The Lynels roared, all their subordinate fellows joining in an explosion of noise, and Zelda ducked her head behind the rock, squeezing her eyes shut as if she could close out the world. The crash of a thunderbolt rocked the hillside, and she covered her ears to block out the noise, the pressure. She thought her hearing was damaged, because the noise did not fade. The crush kept building inside of her skull, and it was another 5 seconds before she realized it was just continuing, rolling on and on without ceasing. Below it was the sound of bokoblins screaming, the death cries of moblins, the challenge of the Lynels. But first, most insistent, was the thunder. "What is that?" She raised her head, stared, did not understand what she was seeing. A ribbon of light went through the air, tracing a course between each of the beasts that had come to kill the princess and her god, and each time it drew nearer to one there was a crash of thunder, a scream, a flying body. The ribbon seemed attached to a blur, and she saw the Lynels and lowered her head again, flapping her hands over her ears. "No, think. That sound, you've heard that before." When was it? A bokoblin wandering across their path on the long trip from the desert to the mountain. Link drawing the Master Sword, which flashed and roared a single high jagged note when he struck the bokoblin down. No, this isn't like that. But maybe it is. Maybe if it were repeated enough times, so close together, it... The thunderclap rolled on, and the beating of massive hoofs was nearly drowned out beneath it. Is that Link? Was he the one holding the... Was that the Master Sword? It must have been. What else? Who else could it have been? But to look like that, to leave those trails, ow. Her thoughts ceased to order themselves into words, and she was left to formless questions like images imprinted on the spots that swam in her vision as she squeezed her eyes shut. To make the Master Sword roar that way, how many times was he striking his foes? Every second. To leave those streaks in the air, how quickly was he moving between his targets? How could he process information that fast? She thought she'd understood his strength from watching him spar with the other champions. But it was as if the Master Sword was lightning in his hand, as if he were one of the gods descended to smite the forces of darkness. A moment of silence, stretching long enough for her to open her eyes and lower her hands. Then a single bark of the Master Sword, and the death cry of a Lynel followed by the sound of a heavy body slumping to the ground. "What is he?"
"Princess."
At the sound of his voice, controlled, though he could not hide his concern from her like he could for other people, she heard the quiet tremble there. She rose. She did not know what she would see when she looked at him, so she did not see him first. First she saw the field of bodies, the scattering of dozens of monsters laid low in a matter of seconds. He had slain them as if they'd been made of straw, as if they hadn't even been real. "What is he?" With great effort she looked at him, and he stood there, and when their eyes met his brow relaxed and he exhaled, as if he'd been holding their breath the entire time she was out of sight. His left hand held his right forearm, and she could see blood running between his fingers from where one of the monsters had marred him. One wound, all of that, and one wound, and it was such a small thing, compared to what he had done. He barely seemed to notice it, except to hold pressure there. He was looking only at her, and now he sheathed his sword and began to walk back.
Wait there,
she said, rummaging through their pack for bandages. There were no monsters, now, and he obeyed, staring at her without any expectations, any suppositions about who she was or what she should be doing. It had taken her so very long to understand the weight of his eyes, to stop thinking of him as an extension of the sword he carried. She would not slip from that now, not when he had done all of that and still found space in himself to fear for her. The warmth in his eyes when he had looked at her was answered by a warmth that spread through her chest, and she could not give a name to that feeling now, but she would, in time. She retrieved the bandages and antiseptic and started walking toward him, first going down the path that he had slid past. It would be a century before she knew the answer to her last question. The effort of retrieving and reliving memory took its toll on the princess, as it always did. She wanted to continue onward, to cut across Death Mountain and reach the Akala Tower, but after dealing with Varudonir, receiving Durk's blessing, facing the Fireblight, and all these memories and questions about Link, exhaustion told on her resistance. When Paya began to make camp on the spot where she had regained her last memory, Zelda did not do more than offer up the faintest of protests. Paya built the fire, and Zelda roasted mushrooms, and the two of them had a very simple dinner. Zelda spread out her bedroll, got halfway through a sentence about how she could have continued, and then fell asleep. She wouldn't wake until sunrise, easily. It was hours before Paya lay down in turn. She had built the fire in such a position that Zelda unknowingly made her bed against the same rocky outcropping she had hidden behind a century before, which allowed Paya to lie facing outward. There were no beasts on this part of the mountain. The proximity of the stable was testament to that. Still, after what seemed a long time, the boulder breaker and the light-scale trident gave off a soft glow. Neither woman saw that, of course, nor did they see when the ghosts of the champions manifested, then took their places next to the fire. Dark and Mipha sat near to each other, positioned so that each could see both sleepers. They did not look at each other directly. They watched the fire, and listened to the night, and sat under the stars for the first time in a century. The world moved around them, and they were part of it, however ephemeral that part might be. After a companionable silence, Dark said,
"Been a long time." "It has. It is such a relief to hear your voice again, Dark. I have missed you dearly." "Me too. It was quite the wait, wasn't it? All that cold and dark. Almost enough to make you forget what you were waiting for." "Almost.